From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Kraig Roozeboom will discuss the findings of a long-term project of cover crop performance in a wheat-sorghum-soybean rotation. This will be the topic that Kraig will speak on at the upcoming K-State Cover Crops Field Day taking place this Friday, and we'll inform you on that as well. Then, the next in this week's series featuring County Extension agricultural agents who are here on the campus for the annual Research and Extension Conference. Today, a visit with Clark County agent Brice Gibson, who reflects on his part in the response to the Starbuck wildfire that ravaged his county and neighboring counties last spring. And with this week's commentary on rural Kansas, K-State's Gus Vander Hoeven. All that here on Agriculture Today.
Science Communication Week is coming to Manhattan November 6th through 11th. Kansas State University, Sunset Zoo, and Flint Hills Discovery Center are bringing together local science students, professors, and professionals, as well as journalists from National Public Radio and National Geographic to share their insights and discoveries. Find out about all the free public events at k-state.edu/SciComm. That's k-state.edu/SciComm.
Ahead this Friday, November the 3rd, the Department of Agronomy at Kansas State University welcomes in all producers with any level of interest in cover crops as part of a cropping system for a special field day that'll take place just south of Manhattan at the Ashland Bottoms Research Area. And we're going to talk about that program, what it's going to share with producers, and dig a little deeper into one of the presentations now with our guest, who is a cropping systems agronomist with K-State, Kraig Roozeboom. Kraig, you'll be talking specifically about 10 years of cover crops in a no-till wheat-sorghum-soybean rotation, and we'll get into that in just a few moments. But talk about the nature of this field day and what its intent is, if you would.
Well, I think the intent is to highlight a lot of the work and activity, not just research work, but educational activity that the Department of Agronomy has been engaged in with cover crops for several years. And so for several years now, the agronomy field days have tried to maintain a central theme or a focus. And so this year we're highlighting the cover crops work that we're doing, and a lot of that has been done or is being done down at Ashland Bottoms. And so it provides a nice site for the activities on Friday.
And what's your read on the interest in cover crops out there? It seems to be substantial.
That's right. If anything, I think it's still growing. There are a lot of reasons for that. Obviously, the whole no-till community has had a large interest in cover crops for several years. The NRCS, as an agency, has highlighted cover crops as a key component of their soil health initiative. There are just a lot of things over many years now that have kind of raised the profile of cover crops. Not that they're brand new. I think it's just the level of interest and the extent of adoption, honestly, that's increased in recent years.
It has to do with a heightened interest in soil health, perhaps?
That's one of the topics that has driven this, and on a national and international scale, not just soil health, but now the term plant microbiome has come up, and that involves all the organisms that live in relationships with plants and in the soil, etc. And so these are all related, and I think from our perspective, that's a piece of it, but in a lot of ways we're looking at, okay, how do we incorporate these things into our agronomic systems, our crop production systems here in Kansas? What are the impacts in terms of soils? I think some of the speakers will be covering soils, environmental impacts. Weed suppression is another driver, I think, of recent interest with the whole herbicide resistance in a lot of our weed populations in recent years. One area that we probably won't be touching on, but is still a huge driver, is the whole area of grazing and forage production that often goes with the adoption of cover crops or intensifying rotations with species that can be either used as cover crops or forages or both. And so we won't be addressing that very directly, but we will really be focusing on, okay, as we incorporate these cover crops in our systems, what are some of the things we've seen or we might expect in all these different areas?
There will be sessions touching on several of those things you just mentioned throughout this day, which begins, by the way, at 9 o'clock Friday morning at the Ashland Bottoms site, which we'll direct you to in just a moment. For your part, again, you've been conducting a decade of research using cover crops in this rotational system, no-till, wheat, sorghum, soybeans. What specific cover crops have you been evaluating within that system, Kraig?
Well, as you mentioned, 10 years. So in 2007, we initiated this study down there at Ashland Bottoms, and we've had other work, or I've been involved in other work as well, but this is one that's been continuous for the past 10 years. And when we initially set up the study, we had 4 categories of cover crops we wanted to look at. So we had 2 summer cover crops planted after wheat. One would be a legume and one a non-legume. And then 2 winter or fall planted cover crops, or at least cold adapted crops. Again, 1 legume and 1 non-legume. And so with that array, you're encompassing kind of the major divisions of crop types, whether they're legume or not, and whether they're more adapted to the warmer temperatures of summer or the cooler temperatures of winter and fall. And so that's been a constant. And I said for 10 years, but it's a 3-year rotation, and so that's been imposed through 3 cycles of that rotation. The specific cover crops in each of those classes has changed a little bit over the years, some of it because of just success or lack of success with particular species, and we felt we had to make a change to have a little more consistency. And so when we look at our summer cover crops, the summer non-legume has consistently been a sorghum Sudan grass hybrid, or hybrid sorghum Sudan grass. It has shifted in recent years, for the past 4 or 5 years, to a shorter stature BMR dwarf hybrid. And the reason we went to a BMR, that's brown midrib, less lignin, hopefully cycle that residue a little faster in the system. It's a brachytic dwarf. It still gets 8 to 10 feet tall, but it's not super tall. And the idea being it's just a little easier to manage that residue. But that's been fairly consistent. On the summer legume side, it's consistently been a late maturing soybean. The specific varieties have changed over the years, but anywhere from a group 5.5 to a group 7.5. And both of these, sorghum Sudan and the late maturing soybean, we get into the field as soon as we can after wheat harvest. And obviously, soil moisture conditions play a role in that decision. Sometimes we are delayed because we need a rain to get that initial flush of volunteer wheat out of the way. And we've kind of gone back and forth on the best way to handle getting that in the ground. I think some of the latest plantings we've had have been, mid-July, and some of the earliest have been like the 3rd or 4th week of June, right after wheat. But in every case, we get a good 60 days of growth out of those summer species. So by the time you get to late September, that sorghum Sudan grass is just starting to head, or the late maturing soybeans are just starting to set pods. And we really don't want them to go past that stage for a couple of reasons. One, we don't want a lot of extra seed out there introducing volunteer cover crops, the way we manage this system. We're going into sorghum. And the other is, the longer you wait after it, like sorghum Sudan in particular, the longer you wait after it heads, the more lignin gets laid down in that residue and the longer it will last. And in some systems that may be desirable if you're trying to get long-lasting residue, but where we're going into grain sorghum, we're going to have a nice residue load from that grain sorghum crop. So that's not a priority in this rotation. And so we have rolled those down with a roller crimper then in late September, early October, just depends on the year, and then maintain that until sorghum planting next spring.
So that's how you've managed the warm season cover crops in this system. What about the cool season options you've been researching?
Well, for the winter covers, again, a legume and a non-legume. It's been fairly consistent on the non-legume side that we've had some kind of a brassica species. So for the first 3-year cycle, we had canola, and pretty much ever since then it's been a radish, a tillage radish or daikon radish, which are fairly common in a lot of mixtures out there. And the idea there is it's a non-legume. Obviously, you're not fixing nitrogen. but it's tap-rooted. It can go down and theoretically mine residual nitrogen from the system and keep it in play, so to speak, so you're not losing it to volatilization or leaching, etc. The other thing about these brassicas is if you get a nice stand, they do a very nice job of out-competing weed populations and making a very nice no-till seed bed the next spring. Mm-hmm. And so that's been the idea there with the radishes. Frost usually takes them out, or sometime over the winter these first frosts don't kill them off. But by the time you get to the spring, typically they're dead. But you've got a nice, fairly weed-free no-till seed bed to work with in the spring.
And your legume for the winter period then?
Right, and that's the one that we've had the most variation over the years. We started out with winter peas. One year we had great success, but from then on, less success for the next couple of years. And so we would get a stand typically, but they don't tend to put on much growth in the fall, and a lot of their growth comes in the spring, but we had trouble getting them to survive until the spring. And some of that may have been with variety selection. Maybe we needed to be more careful about finding more winter hardy varieties. But that's just to illustrate why we decided to move away from the winter pea. Since then, it's been in clovers, and for the past several years in crimson clover. And that, again, doesn't put a lot of growth on in the fall, but it does put, in most years, a decent amount of growth on before it either goes dormant for the winter, and in some of our harsher winters, it will die out over the winter. But usually it's put on enough growth that we feel like we've gotten what we want out of it. And so that's been a nice fit for us.
Kraig, we need to step aside for a moment here. When we return, we'll talk more with K-State's Kraig Roozeboom about his long-term research into the role that cover crops can play in a no-till wheat, sorghum, soybean cropping rotation, as will be featured at that K-State Cover Crops Field Day this Friday. We'll be back shortly here on Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. In the guest chair with us once more is Cropping Systems agronomist Kraig Roozeboom of K-State's Department of Agronomy, which will be hosting once more this Friday its 2017 Field Day, which will focus on cover crops and the large volume of K-State research on the various functions of cover crops in our cash cropping systems. Toward the end of our conversation with Kraig, we will point out one more time the details for registering in advance to be part of that field day, but it is coming up this Friday, November the 3rd at 9 o'clock. That'll be at the Ashland Bottoms Research Farm, which is located south of Manhattan in the Kansas River Valley. We'll give you a better idea of how to get there further ahead. And Kraig's been talking with us in more detail about his presentation at that field day, which will cover 10 years of cover crop research within a no-till wheat, sorghum, and soybean rotation. They've been looking at both warm season and cool season crops, legumes and non-legumes, incorporated into the appropriate points of that rotation. And Kraig, you noted earlier you are most assuredly interested in how those cover crop options perform within the rotation of their own volition, but that you're very much interested in the subsequent effects on the cash crops themselves and how well they perform. Let's speak to that a bit.
Right, and honestly, it's not so much the performance of the cover crops as the performance of the system with those cover crops. We've got, obviously, a check where we have nothing. We call it the chemical fallow. It's all no-till, but we leave it in wheat stubble, and then we're spraying that with herbicides to try to maintain it in a weed-free or relatively weed-free condition. And then the other alternative you could call it a check, would be a double crop soybean after wheat harvest. And we see that as another way to intensify the system, get a different crop species out there in between the wheat and the sorghum, get a legume, broadleaf out there, but also then have the opportunity for a cash return, a revenue return from that land if we are able to harvest double crop soybeans. It's the same base rotation. The cover crops appear between the wheat and the grain sorghum or the double crop soybeans. That's when all the treatment action is. And so we're saying, okay, we put these in, what happens to the rest of the rotation? And obviously grain sorghum being the next crop, that's where we focused most of our attention, and that's where we've honestly seen most of the response. But then we also track, okay, after the sorghum we plant soybeans. Do these cover crops have an effect there? After the soybeans we're planting wheat. Do those effects carry over that far? And then we keep repeating it. And I might say that, yes, we've run this 3-year cycle 3 complete times on every plot out there. Actually, by the last summer, that cycle is complete. But every phase is present every year. And so it's not like we've only run it 3 times. Mm-hmm. It's run 9 times, actually, but 3 times on a given piece of ground.
And so you'll be passing along specific results on subsequent crop productivity and how these cover crops have contributed at the field day. That's your intent.
That's right. We'll look at how the crops have responded, sorghum, soybeans, wheat. One of the big questions we get is about, okay, cover crops are going to burn up all my soil moisture,
mm-hmm. Right.
And that's going to be a downer for my cash crop. And so we've done some measures of soil moisture changes in these different cover crop systems, and so we'll discuss some of those results. And we've also in recent years done a pretty intensive round of sampling in terms of nutrient stratification in the soil. And the idea there is in no-till systems where you're not mixing that top layer of soil, often nutrients will accumulate at the surface. Your non-mobile nutrients like phosphorus primarily is the one that comes to mind. But we looked at other nutrients, things like pH as well. And so we did 3 years of sampling and looked at what's happening to the distribution of nutrients in that top 3 feet or so, 3.5 feet. And are the cover crops changing the way those nutrients stratify or not? You know, we talked about Nebraska as being good at pulling nutrients from deep and towards the surface. Well, are they making the stratification worse, perhaps? That's one possibility. What's happening in terms of, well, if you've got those deep roots, maybe you're getting more organic matter being deposited deeper into the profile. And so that's one of the things we looked at as well.
And you're going to share all of that at this field day. Suffice it to say, these cover crops are performing in a positive sense in these systems?
I think, let's just say that in terms of crop performance, yields of the other crops in the rotation, I think we've demonstrated that we can put cover crops in this rotation at this location and have either a neutral or positive effect on the yields of those remaining crops. Now, some scenarios, some of the cover crops maybe aren't such a good fit. The sorghum sedan ahead of sorghum, honestly, is probably not that great of an idea. And that's the one crop type or specific species and it makes sense. You're just not adding a diversity that you probably need in that rotation. In 2012, when many of these plots had only seen the cover crops twice, one of the worst drought years we've had in recent years, every crop that had cover crops on there were yielding either equal to or better than plots that hadn't seen cover crops.
Which is interesting when you dovetail that with the question of soil moisture availability.
Exactly. And so some of our other data would say soil moisture in our environment, and in the years we did it, we had pretty decent spring rains. We recharged and had a minimal impact no negative impact on the next sorghum crop due to moisture. And so I think we've demonstrated some of those things. I think we've also seen that maybe they don't have as dramatic impact on soil organic matter as some people might think. That's something that just doesn't change very fast. And the nutrient stratification, maybe there's an indicator here or there that they're having an effect, but overall, pretty minimal differences. And when you're talking about nutrient stratification, I believe the big change comes when you move from tillage to no-till. And then the cover crops might modify that, but it's not going to be a dramatic change.
You're looking forward to quite an exchange and dialogue about these matters at the field day then, and inviting producers to come in with their questions about these systems.
I'm sure we'll have a wide range of opinions or questions out there in terms of producer experience, and that's the thing about these in almost any agronomic practice that we do a lot of research on. You know, we try to either mimic what's going on out in the field or at least capture a realistic scenario in our research, but every producer's situation is slightly different, right? And so if they don't have the exact same rotation, or if they manage their cover crops slightly differently, that's going to impact how the rotation performs or how the cover crop performs and what have you. And so I think that's the critical aspect of that, is thinking through, okay, these are the results we've seen, and that's why we chose these widely contrasting crop types, cover crop types, to kind of establish the range of possibilities, and then maybe we can interpolate what likely scenarios are for in between those extremes.
It'll be a morning full of good information on not only this aspect of cover crop performance in the rotation that we're discussing here with Kraig, but on using cover crops for weed suppression, as he noted earlier, improving soil quality with cover crops, protecting surface water with cover crops, and fertility management in combination. And soybean yields and cover crops will be covered, as well as nitrogen management as it would relate to cover crops. It's all to be part of this field day this Friday. We'll tell more about specifics in just a moment, but Kraig, looking forward to it, and we appreciate just a quick overview of your work in this area and the things that you'll be discussing at the field day come Friday. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Eric. We appreciate the opportunity to discuss it.
Kraig Roozeboom is a cropping systems agronomist with K-State Research and Extension. He's on the agenda for this 2017 Agronomy Cover Crop Field Day. That's taking place this Friday, the 3rd of November, starting at 9 o'clock with registration. It'll wrap up around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. There will be a lunch on site. The field itself is located toward the south of Manhattan, just off of McDowell Creek Road. You can access that near the Kansas River Viaduct to the north or I-70 to the south. But by all means, register today. This is your last opportunity to get on the meal count for this field day. You can do so by calling Troy Lynn at the Department of Agronomy right away. The number is 785-532-5776. Again, Troy Lynn at 785-532-5776. to reserve your spot at the K-State Agronomy Field Day, which will focus on cover crops this coming Friday near Manhattan. You are tuned in to Agriculture Today. We'll break away once again when we return. The next in this week's series of visits with county extension agricultural agents from around the state who have convened this week for the annual K-State Research and Extension Conference. In a moment, we'll speak with an agent who had barely begun his extension career earlier this year before he was called to duty in a big way amidst one of the most overwhelming agricultural disasters this state has ever seen. We'll talk with him in a few moments. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Agriculture Today returns now here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson here. As we noted yesterday on the broadcast, we are featuring throughout this week several of our county extension agricultural agents from around Kansas who are attending on the campus this week the 2017 Annual Extension Conference. And one of those who've agreed to come in and visit with us a bit is from Clark County in southwest Kansas, which was the focal point for quite an event, unfortunately, this past year. Brice Gibson is with us, Clark County Extension Agricultural Agent. Brice, you are relatively new. You just started earlier this spring in your position. And part of the reason we bring you by today is that you had been on the job an extraordinarily short time before the Starbuck fire incident took over in your county, right?
Yes. I had been on the job 3 weeks, and then the fire came through on March 6th. And to say it's been a trial by fire in my experience so far.
Talk about that, for you had been on 3 weeks, and then the fire spread over the better part of Clark County, parts of adjoining counties as well, caused the devastation that is so well documented now, and folks are familiar with it. What were you thrust into immediately there?
It was really ground zero. You got to think about the producers and everybody's essential needs first, whether it be food, water, and then think about long-term needs, housing, fencing, and what we're going to need to move forward.
And so when this happened, you found yourself responding to questions, helping organize responses. Is that kind of how it played out?
Yes. We had a emergency response team as myself, our mayor, our county sheriff, as well as the Comanche County Extension Agent, the Meade County Extension Agent, and several community members in Ashland served on this committee, and we split up different areas of expertise where I got food and clothing, and one person took volunteers, one person took hay, one person took just several other issues. And if one person got a call, we'd put it to the person that needed it.
And you were, in effect, on duty with those responsibilities for several days, were you not? If not a couple of weeks or so? Or
2
maybe
weeks,
maybe longer?
And then I kind of also moved around between food and clothing as well, now and longer term with producers' needs, even the next year and a half, 2 years out. So in the initial, we had our food and clothing pantry there at the fairgrounds, and everyone got what they needed and had an abundance of food and clothing. So we then donated it to a worthy cause and had almost a 3/4 truck full. Mm-hmm. And then now we're looking at things like range management and things we can do to help producers.
That's where you're at today with the education informational aspect and have been for several months, helping producers adjust and recover, grass management, herd rebuilding. All of these things are going on now, correct?
Yes.
And how well is it going?
I believe it's right on course. We had rains throughout the summer. Yes, there is weeds and forbs in the pastures, but that's expected. And even though if producers manage their pastures the way they need to, we will then see a growth in their grasses come back in later years.
So it's springing hope from what was disaster for a number of producers with respect to their grass resources. Are they showing signs of bringing their herds back together at this point then?
It's kind of a slow process because many, or some, well, I wouldn't say many, but some producers lost up to 100% of their herds. And you can't just take those genetics and rebuild them overnight. But yes, they're starting to rebuild, and it's just a slow process.
As is the infrastructure, fences, for instance.
Yes.
The latest word was that perimeter fences were finally getting put into place. Cross fences still a long ways to go.
Yes, that's what I would say where we're at. And that's probably going to be, I'd say, a year and a half, 2-year project at least.
How are supplies holding out for producers in need for that purpose and everything else as they rebuild? Are there still needs there?
Yes, I would say supplies for those would be greatly needed for donation if at all possible.
So that initiative continues and the need
Yes.
for it continues. As a new extension agent, this had to be an immediate learning experience. How have you benefited from this, although it was thrust upon you so abruptly, Brice?
It helped me just jump right into my extension career. I get to be something groundbreaking and get to help so many people right away.
The resilience of folks in Clark County and that whole area which was afflicted by the wildfire, though, that it's been impressive, and it has to have been part of the experience here, right?
Yes, they are a great, resilient group, and that's what I believe is going to get them through this, and what has got them through this at this point.
This has had the bulk of your attention for the last few months. Hopefully and presumably you're looking at some other things beyond wildfire recovery as part of your extension agricultural program. Is that part of the plan eventually?
Yes. Right now we have that 5-state beef conference coming up in November. Justin Wagner's coming down and helping put that on. Mm-hmm. And then just getting into the flow with more production-oriented meetings versus the range management and fencing and other meetings.
There are other needs beyond the response, of course. But
right.
Once again, though, this has been quite a first year for our new county extension agricultural agents. So we're wishing you the best because, as you say, there's a lot to do. Just as a last thought, the coordination of all of those who responded in this situation, that had to be gratifying, was it not?
It was quite an undertaking, and I'm so grateful for our town mayor, and he was very much a big part of that, and he took that on his shoulders, and he was a big reason why we got everything done the way we did.
Well, it's a story that really speaks to the character of rural Kansas, and specifically the folks in Clark County, and you were a part of helping that recovery head in the right direction after what was a devastating episode back in springtime. And, Brice, we appreciate it very much, what you've done, and the fact that you've come over and told us a bit about the county agent's perspective in responding to all of that here earlier this year. Wishing you the best as your career unfolds here in Clark County. Thank you for being with us right here.
Thank you.
Brice Gibson with us. He's the Clark County Extension Agricultural Agent. They're based in Ashland, and among those county agents who are all in town for the annual Extension Conference here at K-State this week. This is Agriculture Today, and we'll be back in a few moments with more here on the K-State Radio Network. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen. This is our state, Kansas.
Of course, by this time of the year, the selection and availability of bulbs is getting limited.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
A few weeks ago, I planted daffodils close to the benches on the hill. There are 4 stations along the trail where I've placed a bench. The benches are set in such a way that they provide a resting place when walking the trail, but also reward with a view over the open, grassy area. It's a long trail. Actually, it's not a long trail. But if one is learning to walk again, it is long enough with the benches to rest upon. One station is actually not a wooden bench, but a bench made of a rock and stone. That station is against an oak. I used 2 heavy square rocks, flint and limestone, as support, and on top I laid a flat, thick black slab of sandstone, which I hauled to Kansas 43 years ago. I used that heavy slab as counterweight in a modified U-Haul trailer, which I had modified as a pony trailer to bring Star, our pony, along. It was his stable for the 2.5 days we traveled west. Anyway, those seating stations needed some cheering up. This spring, I expect Anneke, my wife, to walk the trail again as exercise and enjoyment. I didn't want to make the added plant material too outlandish, and where I normally would have selected only native grasses and forbs for our natural landscape on the hill, I figured that close to the benches a less Puritan approach would be in order. Of course, by this time of the year the selection and availability of bulbs for colors, shapes, and sizes is getting limited, as it is getting late in the season of planting. However, with the bulb prices marked down, there may be some interesting bargains still for you if you go to the nursery and plant those in your yard. One of the planting issues to remember is that unless you plant in a rock garden, a massive planting of many bulbs is often more interesting than a sparsely grouped display. Also, where I planted, I must keep deer in mind. Deer eat tulips, and even though bright tulips might look great near a bench with a big rock, I did not plant any tulips. The deer would eat them before they will bloom. Just imagine you watch the tulips in spring poking their first leaves up through the mulch. You notice the flower bud just showing some color and promise. Then, the next morning, all gone. Nibbled off. I know that deer and mice will leave daffodils alone, hence my choice to plant only daffodils. After the rain, it didn't take long to plant 100+ bulbs. Now, when it rains some more and or snows, I know they're down there protected and will pop up this spring. I didn't want to make a Dutch Keukenhof, well known by those who visit the Netherlands, bulb district, in spring. No, not that kind of extravaganza of bulbs of all types, colors and flowers. It's a fantastic show, prepared just as I did my view bulbs in the fall and managed greenhouses for interplanting and replacement plantings, because bulbs bloom early, mid-season or late season. And to enjoy continued blooming, you have to plan and arrange your plantings. The same holds true if you plant bulbs in the home landscape. Spread their blooming time out over several weeks, and do not only use tulips or daffodils, but use the great variety of spring bulbs to really experience spring. But bulbs are not cheap, and one bulb doesn't do it. Oh, to poke fun at a friend's yard, I have smuggled in and planted one bulb near the middle of the lawn, hoping it would bloom before mowed off as a weed. Which reminds me, many years ago on a visit of my mother, she planted a cluster of red tulips near the base of a big maple in front of the big white farmhouse we lived in then, in Blacksburg, Virginia. She never told me. My surprise in spring, long after my parents had returned home, when I noticed tulips coming up where I knew I had never planted any. I watched them grow and develop flowers. Then they showed their red color. It was the bulb Apeldoorn, a very strong one, and the cluster bloomed for a long time, protected by the shade and the trunk of the big tree. It's a thought you might consider. To plant bulbs as a surprise gift is a fun idea. A few years ago, when we lived one fall in the rented cabin of friends, I bought bulbs, tulips, daffodils, crocus, and others. I planted them all around the cabin, but never told them I had done so. When spring came, I was anxious to hear from them. As the weeks slipped by and the weather turned warmer, the bulbs grew out above the ground cover and made a great show. Surprise! I think when you plant them in the fall, they are a great Christmas gift. And when you plant daffodils, they keep on coming back, year after year after year. especially when planted in good soil on a good site. On our farm, we had a camper standing in the trees. A great spot. Years ago, I planted daffodils, which a friend had enjoyed in her garden, and when she dug them up in the spring, I collected them and planted them around and near the camper in the woods. There, in the deep, organic soil, with deep leaf mulch, they grow and grow. Each spring, there is this show of colorful flowering bulbs. It's a show reminding me of my friend.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on rural Kansas. That's our time for today. As always, we appreciate you being along with us. And until we return tomorrow, Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.